It happened on a slow morning, the kind where you scroll without thinking. His name wasn't where it should have been. No posts, no profile picture, nothing in my feed. For a moment, I assumed he'd taken a break from social media, maybe to focus on work or avoid the noise that comes with sudden attention. A quick search from a separate account told a different story. His profile was active, posts from just hours ago filled with likes and comments. He hadn't vanished. He had simply vanished from my view. I had been blocked. The initial reaction wasn't anger. It was a strange blend of confusion and quiet recognition. We'd started this journey together, worked late nights side by side, built something from scratch. And now, without a word, my connection to him was cut off completely. What he didn't seem to remember, or perhaps chose to forget, was that the foundation he was standing on still had my name written into it. This wasn't just the end of a friendship. It was the start of something far more complicated. We first crossed paths at a small creative meetup in the city. He stood out immediately confident, on stage, quick with ideas, and unafraid to put himself in front of a crowd. What he didn't have yet was structure. His work was raw, his following small, and his approach scattered. That's where I came. And my background was in production and brand development, the kind of work that doesn't draw applause, but makes projects sustainable. Our first collaboration was meant to be a one-off. But the chemistry was impossible to ignore. He brought energy and a distinct style that audiences responded to, while I handled everything that happened behind the scenes: scheduling, editing, distribution, and outreach. Over time, our roles settled into a natural rhythm he created. I made sure his creations reached the right people in the right way. When we decided to turn it into something bigger, I took care of the groundwork. I registered the domain, secured the brand name, set up the social media handles, and filed for the relevant rights and licensing. At the time, it felt like routine admin, insurance for a project we weren't sure would even turn a profit. We never imagined it might one day be worth fighting over. The early days were demanding but rewarding. We'd spend hours in my apartment, bouncing between brainstorming sessions and editing marathons. There was no talk of contracts between us because trust seemed like enough. We both believed that if success ever arrived, it would belong to us equally. Looking back, that assumption was my first mistake. The first signs were small enough to dismiss. Messages that used to get an instant reply started sitting unread for hours, sometimes days. Our usual brainstorming calls were rescheduled more often than they happened, always with a casual "sorry, things are crazy right now." I told myself it was just the pace of success catching up with him, that the work we'd started together was still our shared priority. Then the gaps started to widen. I'd learn about public appearances from third parties, usually after they'd already taken place. A friend would send me a link to an event live stream, and there he'd be on stage, under the brand we built without me. Whenever I asked about it, his answers were short. It came up last minute, or "didn't think you'd be interested in that one." The words were polite, but the message underneath was clear. I wasn't part of those decisions anymore. The tone of his communication changed too. Where we once bounced ideas back and forth in a rush of energy, now his replies read like they'd been written for a stranger. Businesslike, efficient, stripped of the shorthand we used to share. When I tried to bring up project updates, new opportunities, content ideas, potential collaborations, he waved them off. "I'll handle it," he'd say, sometimes without even asking for details. Or, "It's not a big deal right now," as though the work we'd built our friendship on was now a side hobby he could manage alone. The real break came without warning. One day, I opened our messages to send him a file, only to find the conversation thread gone. His profile wasn't visible. At first, I thought it was a glitch, but a quick check from another account told me the truth. I'd been blocked. Not muted, not unfollowed, blocked outright. It would have been easier if that was the whole story, But the days that followed brought a confirmation of something deeper. Mutual acquaintances mentioned hearing him speak in interviews about his creation, crediting the project's origin entirely to himself. My name never came up. The audience he was building had no idea I existed. And that absence wasn't an oversight. It was deliberate. In the space of a few months, it's gone from being the other half of a partnership to a silent ghost behind the curtain. The personal sting was one thing, but the professional risk was bigger. If he controlled the public narrative long enough, my contributions could vanish from memory, even though they were still secured in contracts and registrations. That was the moment the stakes became clear. This wasn't just about losing a friend. It was about protecting the work and the credit I had earned before both were erased completely. Confrontation would have been the easy choice. A phone call, an accusation, a demand for answers. But easy doesn't always mean effective. His decision to block me told me two things. He wanted me out of the picture, and he believed I had no way back in. That assumption was more valuable than any explanation he could have given. In my desk drawer, the original rights paperwork sat in a worn folder, untouched since the day we signed it. I pulled it out, scanned each page, and confirmed what I already knew. My name was still there, tied to every asset we'd created together. The logo he used on every video, the domain that hosted his store, the distribution agreements that kept his content on streaming platforms, all of it still listed me as co-owner rather than announced my position, kept my distance, and quietly verified that nothing had been changed. A few discreet inquiries to service providers confirmed that my access remained intact, my role unaltered. He might have worked hard to erase me from the public version of the story, but legally, the structure hadn't shifted an inch. By staying silent, I let him keep building on a foundation I still partially controlled. The more he invested in it, the more leverage I would have when the time came to act. Every day without a confrontation was another day he underestimated me, and that was exactly how I wanted it. The first week was spent going through the obvious records, the ones I remembered clearly because I'd created them. The trademark registration was still intact, my signature in the same place it had been years ago. Seeing it felt like opening a locked drawer and finding the key still inside. The digital distribution account was even more telling. Not only was it still registered under my email, but the back-end history showed every new upload he'd made in the last year. All of them carried the same identifiers we'd established together, identifiers tied directly to my ownership. In the second week, I turned my attention to suppliers. The merchandise vendor still had my name on their primary account. Their invoices were addressed to me, their payment terms unchanged since the original setup. I sent a casual inquiry to confirm account details, framing it as a routine audit. They responded without hesitation, confirming my position and even noting recent orders under the same branding we'd registered. It was a quiet confirmation that his entire merchandise operation ran through channels, still controlled on paper. By the third week, I began expanding my checks to service providers we hadn't spoken to in years. The hosting company for the website confirmed that my administrative access was still active. I logged in and reviewed the domain registration. Still mine, still paid for under my account. The website itself hadn't changed much structurally, but its traffic had exploded. Every visit, every purchase, every click ran through a platform built on credentials that traced back to me. The turning point came in week 4. I reached out to a contact I kept in touch with at one of the larger streaming platforms. We'd worked together before, and I trusted her discretion. Over a casual phone call, she mentioned something that pulled the whole picture into focus. Recent uploads under our project's name were still using the original branded intro I had personally designed and filed for copyright. That element wasn't just a creative asset, it was intellectual property explicitly registered in my name. The fact that it appeared in every monetized video he'd released meant the revenue was tied to my asset, whether he liked it or not. The 5th and 6th weeks were about consolidation. Every piece of information, from trademark certificates to email confirmations, was saved and timestamped. I made a detailed ledger, dates of registrations, account numbers, renewal confirmations, correspondence logs. It wasn't just about proving ownership. It was about building a sequence of facts so tight there would be no room for argument. With every entry in that ledger, the scope of his dependence became harder to ignore. This wasn't simply a matter of him cutting me out socially. His entire operation, videos, merchandise, branding, and even the platforms he relied on, was built on infrastructure that I still legally owned or outright controlled. He might have been the public face now, but the foundation was still mine. And in a way, the more he expanded without changing that foundation, the stronger my position became. It was no longer just a question of whether I could act. It was becoming a matter of when. Once the documentation was in order, it was time to translate leverage into a plan. I reached out to a media rights attorney I had worked with years earlier on a licensing dispute. His style was methodical, not theatrical, the kind of person who understood that the strongest moves are made without unnecessary noise. I handed him the entire ledger, organized in a way that left nothing to interpretation. We started by mapping out every option, from the lightest touch to the most forceful intervention. At one end, we could send a private notice, giving him the chance to correct the situation quietly. At the other, we could initiate public takedown requests, systematically removing his videos, merchandise, and branded content from every platform that used assets tied to my ownership. Both had weight, but both also carried consequences, and the goal was to restore my position without causing damage that couldn't be undone. The attorney pressed the importance of positioning. If we come out swinging, he said, we remove the possibility of cooperation. If we make the first step reasonable, it frames you as the one seeking fairness. That was exactly the balance I wanted, firm but not vindictive. We built the strategy around that principle. Formal notices were drafted for every platform and supplier involved in the project. Each one clearly outlined my status as a rights holder, attaching the relevant documentation for proof. The language was professional, direct, and free from emotional framing. Every notice included the same stipulation: any future use of the brand, its assets, or associated products would require my written approval. In parallel, we prepared a separate letter addressed to him directly. This was the pivot point, the place where all the preparation would meet the personal side of the story. The letter offered two options: negotiate a licensing agreement that compensated me fairly for continued use, or cease all use of the assets entirely. It was short, legally precise, and impossible to misunderstand. Contingencies were built in from the start. If he ignored the letter, the notice's two platforms would be triggered. If he contested ownership, we had a ready-made evidence package for arbitration. The steps were sequenced so that at each stage, he would see the consequences of inaction without ever being able to claim. He hadn't been given the chance to resolve things professionally. By the time the drafts were finalized, there was nothing left to add. The plan was balanced, airtight, and completely within my rights. There was no gloating in the process, just a steady certainty. I wasn't trying to take anything from him that wasn't mine. I was simply making sure that what was mine was no longer being used without my say. And when the moment came to send those letters, I knew exactly what they represented. Not retaliation, but a return to the position I had earned from the very beginning. The first signs that the plan was in motion came quietly, almost without ceremony. A notification from one of the streaming platforms confirmed that multiple videos under his channel had been flagged for rights verification. By the next morning, 2 of those videos were gone entirely, removed for using registered assets without authorization. There was no public statement from him, but the absence was obvious to anyone paying attention. Gaps where his most viewed content used to be. Days later, the merchandise supplier followed through. They sent a formal email stating that, effective immediately, they could no longer process orders under the project's brand without my written approval. It was concise, just 2 paragraphs, but the weight of it was unmistakable. Any revenue from merchandise, the kind he had been actively promoting, had just come to a full stop. I hadn't spoken a word to him directly, yet the structure around him was beginning to shift. The domino effect continued. Other platforms where the brand had a presence began responding to the notices. Some froze accounts pending verification. Others issued formal requests for updated ownership details. In each case, my documentation was ready and waiting. The process was clean, controlled, and entirely within the legal framework we'd built years ago. It was one thing for him to cut me out of the public narrative. It was another to operate without the permissions he'd assumed were his by default. It wasn't until a week into these disruptions that his name finally appeared in my inbox. The message was short, a request to talk as soon as possible. The tone was polite enough. There was an undercurrent I recognized immediately, the politeness of someone who knows they're speaking from a weaker position. We scheduled a call for that afternoon. He opened with a question that tried to sound casual. "Why are you doing this?" It was delivered like an appeal, but the edge in his voice betrayed his frustration. I kept my answer factual. My ownership hasn't changed. The agreements we made are still in place. If you'd chosen to keep me involved, this wouldn't have been necessary. There was no need to raise my voice. The situation was already speaking louder than either of us could. He tried to frame it as a misunderstanding. "I thought you weren't interested anymore. You never said anything." That was his way of reframing my silence as absence, hoping it would justify his decisions. I didn't let the point slide. Not speaking doesn't mean not owning. We both know these assets were built together. The fact that you didn't see me in front of the camera doesn't erase that. For a moment, there was no response on his end. When he finally spoke again, the assertiveness had drained from his tone. "What do you want to do about it?" It wasn't a challenge anymore. It was an acknowledgement that the choice was no longer his alone to make. I outlined the options as plainly as they had been written in the letter he'd received. Negotiate a fair licensing agreement to continue using the assets, or cease all use entirely. There was no pressure in my voice, just the steady presentation of terms he couldn't ignore. By the end of the call, he agreed to meet in person to discuss the details. The conversation ended with an unsteady "all right," and I could almost hear him recalculating in real time. The shift was clear, not just in the words, but in the absence of the confidence that used to define his tone. The public image he'd built was still intact, but behind the scenes, a control had already begun to slip from his hands. 3 months after that call, everything was on paper again, this time in terms neither of us could twist. The new agreement reinstated my role as co-owner, not as a token mention buried in fine print, but in clear public acknowledgement. A licensing arrangement was formalized, ensuring that as long as the brand continued, fair share of its revenue would come directly to me. The structure we'd built together was finally aligned with the reality of its origins. Our personal friendship didn't survive the process. The calls became purely transactional, stripped of the familiarity we once had. But that was never the point of the fight. I wasn't looking to rekindle late-night brainstorming sessions or relive the early days. What mattered was securing the work, the rights, and the recognition I had earned from the very beginning. Those were the pieces that couldn't be replaced. Looking back, it's clear the silence had been my greatest advantage. Speaking too soon would have given him time to adjust, to hide, to rewrite the story further. By waiting, I let the facts mature, let his dependence on the assets deepen, and positioned myself to act when the timing left him with no easy escape. Preparation gave me options. Patience gave me control. For anyone who's ever been written out of their own work, the principle is straightforward. Protect your foundations. Keep your records, your agreements, your proof, even when you think you'll never need them. And when the moment comes, let the documentation speak first. People can argue over opinions, but they can't erase a paper trail in the end. The brand moved forward, my stakes secured, and the story corrected, not by force, but by facts. If you've been in a similar position, I'd like to hear it. Sometimes the most valuable victories are the ones you win without ever raising your voice.